Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I invite you to pause for a moment, not just to hear this message, but to feel it in your soul. Today, we are not merely talking about a date on the calendar. We are talking about a divine moment in history that echoes through every generation. We are talking about Eid-ul-Adha, a celebration not of festivity alone, but of purpose, power, and principle. Eid-ul-Adha is not just an occasion. It is not simply a day marked by rituals, greetings, or meals. It is a divine appointment in the human story, an encounter between faith and obedience, between the earthly and the eternal. Its origin is not in culture, but in covenant. And to understand its importance, we must go back to where it all began, not just with people, but with purpose. In the ancient rugged landscape of what we now call the Middle East, a man walked with a burden greater than any treasure. His name was Ibrahim. He was not born a prophet. He was not handed faith. He discovered it in the silence of the stars, in the questions that haunted his soul, and in the voice of God that called him out of comfort into destiny. You see, before Eid was a celebration, it was a test. Before it was a holiday, it was a holy challenge. And Ibrahim passed not because he was perfect, but because he was willing. God spoke to him, not once, but over years. He was told to leave his land, his family, and his security, and he obeyed. He was promised a child in his old age, and he waited. He was given a son, and he rejoiced. But then came the ultimate test: offer that very son, that long-awaited promise, on the altar of obedience. Not for punishment, not for cruelty, but to reveal something greater, that the blessing must never become bigger than the one who gave it. Now let's pause and imagine this moment, not as a story we tell, but as a moment we feel. A father holding his son's hand, walking up a mountain. A son strong enough to resist, but choosing to trust. A heart torn between love and loyalty. That's not just sacrifice. That's the highest form of worship. That's surrender in its purest form, and in that very act, the foundation of Eid-ul-Adha was laid. Not by men, but by the meeting of divine purpose and human obedience. And just when the knife was raised, not in violence, but in submission, God stopped him. He said, "I have seen your heart." Because you see, the test was never about blood. It was about belief. It was never about death. It was about devotion, and in place of the son, a ram appeared. God's provision for man's obedience. That moment did not end with relief. It began with revelation that faith is not theory, it is trust in action. That worship is not a song, it is a sacrifice. That when you give what you love most to God, He returns it to you with blessing multiplied. This is the origin of Eid-ul-Adha. It is not merely a festival, it is a spiritual memorial. It commemorates not what man lost, but what man was willing to give. It reminds us that obedience is not outdated. It is eternal. And this is why the purpose of Eid-ul-Adha is not confined to one day of prayer or meat distribution. Its purpose is to realign us with the essence of true faith, surrender without hesitation, trust without evidence, and love without condition. In our modern world, we have become professionals at religion, but amateurs at revelation. We know the rituals, but we've lost the reason. We know the practice, but we've forgotten the purpose. Eid-ul-Adha calls us back. It calls us to remember what it really means to believe, not to go through the motions, but to live with meaning. It challenges us to ask, what is my Ishmael? What is that thing I hold so dearly that, if God asked for it, I would hesitate? Eid is not about the animal, it is about the altar. It is not about what you slaughter. It's about what you surrender, and the beauty of it all is this: when we give God our best, He provides better. When we release what we think we cannot live without, He shows us what we truly need. That is the purpose behind the practice. That is the reason behind the ritual. When Ibrahim stood at that altar, he became more than a man. He became a message for every generation, that God is not looking for your perfection. He's looking for your permission. Permission to lead your life, permission to test your faith. Permission to use your story for His glory. That is what makes Eid-ul-Adha so important, not just to Muslims, but to all of humanity. because at its core it teaches a universal truth, that the path to greatness is paved with surrender. And so, when we celebrate Eid-ul-Adha, we must look beyond the food, the gatherings, the greetings. We must return to the mountain. We must hear the voice that asked for everything and the faith that was willing to give it. Because only then will we understand that Eid is not just a date. It is a destiny. It is the annual reminder that we were created not just to enjoy life, but to fulfill purpose. And purpose always begins with obedience. Sacrifice is not loss. It is not subtraction. It is not about giving something up so you can have less. Sacrifice, in its purest form, is about giving something up so you can receive more. It is not just the act of letting go. It is the act of letting go with the full knowledge that what lies ahead is greater than what you're releasing. This is the heartbeat of Eid-ul-Adha. This is why it matters. Because at the center of this sacred observance is not just the ritual of animal sacrifice. It is the revelation of what it means to live a life of purpose, trust, and selflessness. We must understand something fundamental. The essence of sacrifice is value. You do not sacrifice what you do not care about. Sacrifice costs, and anything that costs you nothing is not sacrifice. It is convenience. The power of sacrifice comes from the weight of what you are willing to place on the altar of obedience. And the story that birthed Eid-ul-Adha teaches us this truth in its rawest, most emotional form. A father, a son, a promise, a decision. Imagine holding in your arms the very thing you prayed for, waited for, cried for. Imagine being asked to lay it down, not because it was bad, not because it was wrong, but simply because the giver wanted to know, do you love the gift more than the one who gave it? That's what sacrifice asks of us. Not only to give, but to prioritize, not only to surrender, but to trust. Sacrifice doesn't just reveal what we love, it reveals who we are becoming. Eid-ul-Adha reminds us that we were not created to cling, we were created to commit. We were not born to hoard blessings, we were designed to become blessings, and you cannot become a blessing until you understand the principle of sacrifice. When Prophet Ibrahim was asked to sacrifice his son, it wasn't just a personal test, it was a global lesson. It showed humanity what it means to walk by faith and not by sight, to trust a promise even when it looks like it's about to die, to give back to God what he gave to you, believing he will restore it in his own way, in his own time, for his own glory. There is no power in empty rituals. The true power of sacrifice is in the heart behind it. Why do you give? Why do you surrender? Is it because it's expected? Or is it because you've reached a place where you recognize that nothing you have is truly yours? That every blessing is borrowed, every gift is grace, and every act of obedience is simply returning to the source what came from him in the first place. When you reach that place, sacrifice becomes an act of worship, not an act of loss. Look around you. Every meaningful life is built on sacrifice. Every family that has stayed together, every leader who has left a mark, every cause that has changed the world. It all started with someone who gave up something they loved for something they believed in. That is the divine logic of sacrifice. You never truly lose what you give in faith. You only multiply it, because sacrifice is not destruction. It is transformation. In the story of Eid-ul-Adha, the ram that replaced the son was not a coincidence. It was divine timing. It was God saying, I see your faith, and I will provide. You see, God never intended to take the boy. He intended to reveal the man. It was not about death. It was about destiny. That's the power of sacrifice. It doesn't take life from you. It unlocks the life within you. Too many of us are praying for breakthrough while holding tightly to what we're supposed to lay down. We want abundance without letting go. We want miracles without movement. But the principle is timeless. You cannot receive with a closed hand. Sacrifice opens your hand. It opens your heart. It opens the doors of heaven. When you sacrifice, you invite divine intervention. This is why during Eid-ul-Adha, we are not just remembering a story. We are reliving a principle. We are reminded that the meat of the animal is not what reaches the heavens. It is the intention, it is the faith. It is the submission, that is what ascends, that is what matters. That is what shifts atmospheres and generations. When you sacrifice something meaningful, your life becomes meaningful. And when you do it with humility, you become unstoppable, not because you are strong, but because you are aligned with something greater than strength. You are aligned with purpose. That's the ultimate power of sacrifice. It doesn't just change what you have, it changes who you are. So when we gather during Eid and prepare to give, we must do it with more than our hands. We must do it with our hearts. It is not about slaughter. It is about surrender. It is not about giving away meat. It is about stepping into meaning. The act itself is symbolic, but the faith behind it is eternal. Sacrifice is not about pain, it's about power. Not power over others, but power over self. The power to choose faith when fear is easier. The power to give when holding back feels safer. The power to obey even when you don't understand. And when you do that, when you truly sacrifice in the spirit of devotion, you step into the legacy of Ibrahim. You step into the rhythm of purpose. You become part of a story that is bigger than you, but that cannot continue without you. There comes a moment in every life when faith is no longer a theory but a decision. A moment when belief is not found in books or words, but in action, in that sacred space between fear and obedience, between comfort and calling. Eid-ul-Adha is a timeless reminder of that moment. It commemorates not only a historic act of devotion, but a universal call to every soul. Will you submit when submission costs you everything? Submission is not weakness. It is not silence. It is not resignation. True submission is the highest form of strength. It is choosing to trust the wisdom of the Creator over the logic of the created. It is standing in the middle of uncertainty and saying, "Yes, Lord," even when the mind screams no. It is obeying when you don't have the full plan. It is stepping out when you can't see the ground. It is believing in purpose when pain surrounds you. That is the level of submission we see in the life of Prophet Ibrahim. And that is the level of submission Eid-ul-Adha calls us to remember. We must understand something clearly. Submission is not tested in comfort. It is tested in conflict, and Ibrahim was not tested with something small. He was tested with the very promise he waited decades to receive. He was not called to let go of a burden. He was called to surrender a blessing. That is a kind of obedience most people never experience, because we are willing to give God what we don't really need, what we don't deeply value. But when He asks for our treasure, our control, our pride, our certainty, that's when we find out what kind of faith we truly have. Submission means releasing control, not because you have no options, but because you trust the one who sees beyond what you can. It is the kind of trust that says, even if I don't understand the why, I will still obey the what. And this is what makes Ibrahim's example so powerful. He rose early in the morning to do what God asked, without delay, without protest, without needing a second opinion. That kind of immediate obedience can only come from someone who has completely surrendered the need to control the outcome. Today, we live in a world obsessed with autonomy, with individualism, with being in charge. We want to choose our path, our timing, our truth, but the truth of life is that the highest fulfillment is not found in independence. It is found in alignment. You were not created to live life on your own terms. You were created to live life on divine terms. That's not bondage, that's freedom, because when you align with your Creator, you are no longer guessing your way through life. You are guided, you are covered, you are anchored. Submission is the gateway to that alignment. It is not about suppressing your voice, it's about elevating your purpose. When you submit to the will of God, you stop surviving and start living. You stop reacting to life and start walking in destiny. And even when pain shows up, you understand that it's not punishment, it's preparation, because everything submitted to God is transformed by God. Nothing offered on the altar of obedience remains ordinary. He always multiplies what we give back to Him. Eid-ul-Adha forces us to ask the question, what have I not yet submitted? We may offer our time, our charity, our words, but have we offered our will? Have we truly laid our dreams, our ambitions, our relationships, our identity before God and said, "Take all of it, shape it as you will"? That is the essence of submission, holding nothing back, trusting that his hands are wiser than your plans. And look at the outcome. When Ibrahim raised the knife, the heavens responded. When he lifted his faith, God lifted the burden. When he obeyed without condition, God provided beyond expectation. That is what submission does. It activates provision. It unlocks dimensions of divine favor that talent, education, and strategy can never access. Because submission is the language of heaven, it tells the Creator, "You are sovereign, you are enough, you are worthy." What we must also remember is that submission is not a one-time event. It is a lifestyle. It is waking up each day and choosing trust again, choosing obedience again, choosing surrender again. It is in the small decisions and the unseen sacrifices. It is in the moments when no one is watching, but heaven is recording. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as walking away from something that feels good but isn't good for your soul. Sometimes it's as hard as staying faithful when no reward seems to be coming. But in each of those moments, heaven is near and God sees. So when we commemorate Eid-ul-Adha, we are not just honoring a prophet's obedience. We are stepping into that same call, the same invitation to lay down our will and pick up his purpose. The same challenge to give God our yes, even when the path is unclear, because when you live submitted, you live protected. When you live surrendered, you live empowered. And when you live obedient, you live fulfilled. This is the legacy of Eid-ul-Adha, not ritual, but revelation, not religion, but relationship. A relationship built on trust. A trust proven through submission, and a submission that always leads to elevation. There is a beauty in Eid-ul-Adha that goes beyond the individual act of devotion. It reaches beyond the sacrifice itself. It touches something deeper, something eternal, our connection to one another. Because the moment you submit to the will of God, the next step is how you treat the people around you. Faith is never meant to stay private. True faith overflows. It changes how we see others. It teaches us that we do not walk alone, eat alone, give alone, or even worship alone. That is the unseen strength of Eid-ul-Adha. It doesn't just pull you closer to God, it pulls you closer to your fellow human beings. We live in a time when the world is divided by lines of race, of nationality, of status, of politics, of language, of wealth. And yet here comes Eid-ul-Adha, cutting through all of it with a single truth: we are one. On this day, millions of people from every nation, every culture, and every background wear the same simple garments, stand on the same sacred ground, and raise the same call to prayer. The rich and the poor, the powerful and the unknown, all equal before God, all accountable to the same Creator, all celebrating the same story of sacrifice and submission. That is not just a religious event. That is a glimpse of divine design. Unity is not something we fabricate. It is something we honor, because God has already made us one. He created one human race, one earth, one family of believers, and the more we forget that, the more divided we become. But Eid-ul-Adha brings us back. It reminds us that unity is not optional, it's sacred, that when we come together in spirit and action, we reflect something greater than ourselves. That unity is not about similarity, it's about shared submission. You don't have to look like me or think like me for us to be united in purpose. And from that unity comes something powerful, generosity. You see, you cannot claim to love God and ignore his people. You cannot celebrate the story of Ibrahim, his sacrifice, his obedience, and then walk past the hungry, the hurting, or the hopeless without lifting a hand. That is why Eid-ul-Adha demands action. It requires the believer not only to sacrifice an animal, but to distribute it, to give, to share, to bless, and not just to friends or family, but to the needy, to the poor, to the stranger you may never see again. Because real generosity doesn't ask what the other person deserves. It only asks what love requires. On this day, around the world, homes that may have been empty are filled with food. Children who often go without are fed. Communities that feel forgotten are remembered, And all because one man centuries ago said yes to God. That is the ripple effect of obedience. When you live for something greater than yourself, you begin to give beyond yourself. You stop counting the cost and start seeing the impact. That's the power of Eid-ul-Adha. It turns belief into action. It transforms worship into compassion. Let's not be mistaken, generosity is not about excess. It's not about giving from what you don't need. It's about giving even when it costs you something. Generosity is not measured by the size of the gift, but by the size of the heart that gives it. It is an act of trust, saying, God, you provided for me, so I will provide for others. And when a community embraces that kind of giving, the result is healing. Walls come down, divisions dissolve, hearts soften, because nothing opens the soul like the act of selfless giving, and this too is what Eid-ul-Adha teaches us, that God is generous, that His provision is not limited, that His grace is abundant, and that when we reflect His nature through unity and generosity, we don't just worship Him, we represent Him, we become His hands in a hurting world. We become His message to the broken, the lonely, the forgotten. We become proof that love is still alive. We are not called to be consumers of blessing, but conduits of it. The meat of the sacrifice will be consumed, yes, but the lesson must remain. The food will be shared today, but the heart of generosity must live beyond the day. Eid-ul-Adha is not a one-day expression of charity. It is a lifelong commitment to compassion. And if we celebrate this day without letting it change how we treat others, then we have missed its message entirely. So, what are we really celebrating? We are celebrating that in a world fractured by division, faith can unite. That in a time when many hold tightly, the people of God can still open their hands. That in an age of selfishness, generosity still speaks louder. And when it does, it silences fear, it heals wounds, it builds bridges, it reminds the world that light still shines in the darkness. Eid-ul-Adha is a moment for the believer to stand up and say, we are one, we are blessed, and because of that, we will bless others. That is not just a festival. That is a movement, a declaration, a call to unity that resounds louder than every difference, and a call to generosity that leaves no one behind. Not because we have to, but because we want to. Because when we truly understand what God has done for us, giving is no longer a duty. It becomes a joy, and that joy, when shared, is what makes this day truly sacred. There is a question every person must answer if they want to live a life that matters. Why am I here? What is my assignment? What was I created to fulfill? Purpose is not found in titles, positions, possessions, or applause. Purpose is found in obedience, and obedience is what activates purpose. That is why Eid-ul-Adha is more than an event. It is a divine reminder, a spiritual reset that echoes through time, saying, you were not born to wander, you were born to walk in purpose. Every act of God in our lives is not random, it's strategic. There are no accidents in divine design. So when Prophet Ibrahim was called to make what looked like an impossible sacrifice, it wasn't because God wanted to hurt him. It was because God wanted to reveal something in him. Purpose is never revealed in comfort zones. It is always discovered in moments of deep surrender, in situations that test our trust, challenge our reasoning, and stretch our faith. Eid-ul-Adha is a mirror. It forces us to look into our own hearts and ask the hard questions. Have I been walking in my assignment? Have I been faithful to the voice of God, or just following the patterns of the world? Have I allowed convenience to replace conviction? This sacred day brings us face to face with the truth. Obedience is the engine of purpose, and there is no greatness without it. We often pray for clarity, for opportunity, for doors to open. But what if the only thing standing between you and your breakthrough is obedience? Not knowledge, not talent, not timing, just simple, humble, consistent obedience. That's what separated Ibrahim, not his strength, not his status, but his unwavering commitment to follow the voice of God, even when it led to a mountain, even when it demanded everything. Purpose is not discovered by asking, what do I want from life? It is discovered by asking, what does life want from me? Or more accurately, what does God want from me? You can spend years climbing a ladder only to realize it's leaning against the wrong wall. Eid-ul-Adha says, come down from that wall, realign your ladder, return to the voice that called you in the first place. Obedience is how we get back on course. It's how we re-enter the flow of divine destiny. We must also understand that obedience is not always rewarded immediately. Sometimes it looks like loss before it looks like victory. Sometimes it's lonely before it becomes legacy, but God never forgets obedience. He records every act, every decision, every moment when you chose His will over your wants. Ibrahim walked up the mountain with a burden, but he walked down with a blessing. That's what purpose does. It turns trials into testimonies. It transforms obedience into elevation, and make no mistake. Purpose is not just about personal fulfillment. It's about impact. It's about legacy. It's about becoming a vessel through which heaven touches earth. When Ibrahim said yes to God, his obedience didn't just affect him. It shaped generations. It set a pattern. It became a blueprint. That's what your purpose is meant to do, not just make your life better, but make others better through your life. Obedience is the seed. Purpose is the harvest, and the two are always connected. You cannot walk in divine purpose while ignoring divine instruction. God does not bless ambition. He blesses alignment. And alignment is only possible through obedience. Sometimes that obedience will require sacrifice. Sometimes it will demand faith that looks like foolishness to others. But in the kingdom of God, obedience is never wasted. Every step you take in faith is a step deeper into purpose. Eid-ul-Adha asks us to remember that even when we don't see the full picture, we are still called to move. God never gave Ibrahim a full explanation. He gave him a command. And the command was enough, because the one who gave it was faithful. That's where real purpose begins, not in clarity but in trust, not in seeing everything but in obeying the one who sees everything. In a world that worships self, Eid-ul-Adha calls us back to divine will. In a culture that says, do what feels right, this sacred day says, do what is right, even if it doesn't feel good. Because obedience is not about emotion, it's about conviction. It's not about ease, it's about calling. And when you live like that, your life becomes more than existence. It becomes evidence that God still speaks, and people still answer. So the next time you find yourself in a place of confusion, delay, or frustration, don't just ask for more signs. Ask yourself, have I obeyed the last thing God told me? A purpose doesn't wait for perfection. It waits for obedience, and obedience doesn't always make sense at first, but it always makes a difference. That is why Eid-ul-Adha matters, because it's not just a call to remember what happened. It's a call to return to what truly matters: purpose, obedience, surrender. These are not outdated ideas. They are timeless truths. And every time we live them out, we don't just honor the legacy of Ibrahim. We step into our own. There is a powerful, humbling truth that stands at the center of Eid-ul-Adha. It is not simply that a man was willing to offer what was most precious to him. It is not only that he obeyed without hesitation. The deeper truth, the eternal message, is this: mercy met him on the mountain. When the blade was raised, heaven intervened. When obedience reached its peak, mercy stepped in. And that mercy came not just as a delay, not just as a reprieve, but as a divine substitution. This is what makes Eid-ul-Adha holy. This is what makes it miraculous. A ram in the thicket, a life spared. A provision where there should have been loss. We are not merely celebrating a man's devotion. We are celebrating a God who sees, a God who provides, a God who steps in at the last moment, not because he changed his mind, but because he wanted to reveal his nature. That nature is mercy. That nature is substitution. When Ibrahim proved that nothing came before his Lord, not his love for his son, not his own understanding, not even his legacy, God responded by showing the world what he had already planned, that he is a God who provides before we even realize we're in need. Divine mercy is not a reaction, it is a decision that began before you were born. It is rooted in the heart of God Himself. It is not earned. It is revealed, and what Eid-ul-Adha reminds us is that the mercy of God meets us precisely at the point of total surrender. You don't encounter divine mercy by bargaining with God. You don't experience substitution by holding back. You meet God's provision when you've laid everything on the altar, when your hands are empty and your heart is full of trust. That is when heaven moves. What we often forget is that mercy is not the absence of justice. It is the fulfillment of it in a different form. God didn't ignore the sacrifice, He replaced it. He didn't erase the cost, He paid it another way, and in doing so, He taught us something essential. His plans are always better than our expectations. We think we are giving up everything, but He's preparing to give us more than we imagined. We think the test is about loss, but the outcome is about revelation, about discovering who He is in a way we never could without walking through the fire of surrender. The ram caught in the thick. It was not a coincidence. It was already waiting. That is the part that overwhelms the soul. While Ibrahim was climbing the mountain on one side, the provision was already climbing on the other. While he was stepping forward in obedience, heaven was orchestrating mercy. That is what divine substitution means. It means God prepares answers before we even ask the questions. He arranges solutions before we even realize there's a need. That's not just a story. It's a reality that's still unfolding in your life today. So when we gather to celebrate Eid-ul-Adha, we are celebrating more than obedience. We are honoring a moment when the heart of God was revealed in the most profound way. We are remembering that in His justice there is mercy, in His commands there is compassion, in His holiness there is provision, and that provision comes not because we are perfect, but because He is faithful. The act of sacrifice that we perform today, the animal that is offered and the meat that is distributed, is not just a symbol of generosity, it is a living testimony of substitution. It is saying, this could have been me, this could have been mine, but God made a way. And when we distribute that meat, when we share what has been given, we are not just feeding bodies. We are proclaiming a message. The mercy of God is enough. It covers, it provides, it reaches everyone, whether they deserve it or not. But this mercy is not a license to live carelessly. It is an invitation to live purposefully. When you understand what God has done for you, you don't walk the same. You don't live entitled. You live grateful. You walk humbly, you forgive freely, you give generously, because you know, if it weren't for the mercy of God, you wouldn't have made it this far. If it weren't for divine substitution, you would still be carrying burdens too heavy to bear. Eid-ul-Adha is a celebration, yes, but it is also a commission. It is a call to live a life marked by the mercy we have received, to extend that mercy to others, to become a source of hope, not judgment, to reflect the character of the one who substituted loss with provision, pain with purpose, and sacrifice with salvation. We cannot receive this mercy and remain silent. We must live lives that echo it. So we celebrate not just with our voices, but with our choices. We celebrate not only in prayer, but in practice. We celebrate the ram, the mercy, the divine substitute, not as an ancient event, but as a present truth. A truth that says, even when we don't see the way, God is already preparing one. A truth that says, even when life tests us, heaven has not forgotten us. And a truth that says, at the peak of surrender, mercy will always meet us. And so, as we reflect on the story of Ibrahim, the sacrifice, the mercy, the unity, the obedience, and the generosity, we must ask ourselves one final question. What will this day change in me? Because Eid-ul-Adha was never meant to be a moment. It was meant to be a movement. A movement of hearts returning to their Creator, a movement of hands reaching out to the poor, a movement of lives realigned with divine purpose. Let this not be a festival of meat alone, but of meaning. Let it not be a day of tradition only, but of transformation, because the same God who provided a ram for Ibrahim is still providing today, for those who trust Him, for those who obey Him, for those who give what they cannot keep to gain what they cannot lose. Eid-ul-Adha is God's reminder to the world, I still speak, I still provide, I still redeem, and I am still worthy of your everything. So walk away from this day not just with full hands, but with a full heart. Let your life echo the same word that echoed from that mountain long ago. Here I am, O Lord. And may your obedience, like Ibrahim's, become a legacy that lives far beyond you. Because when faith and sacrifice meet, destiny begins.